I remember the glaring overhead lights in the security briefing room, the kind that made everything in that space feel too bright. If I close my eyes even now, decades later, I can still see the murmuring group of fellow security officers shifting anxiously, waiting for our assignments. When I first arrived at Travis Air Force Base in early 1982, I had no idea what to expect. I knew I'd be working security or law enforcement of some sort. Back then, I was just excited to serve. I wanted to be the best at my job. I wanted to protect the base. But that kind of wide-eyed optimism wore off fast. And the place that did it for me was a restricted compound inside Travis, one I sometimes guarded for hours on end. The deeper I got into that assignment, the more I realized that the official explanation for what went on there never matched the reality. Travis Air Force Base is situated in Fairfield, California, not far from the bustle of Interstate 80. There's always been lots of movement in and out because it's a major transport hub. Cargo planes, personnel, you name it. It felt huge to me. There was a constant drone of aircraft, the kind of steady background noise you just learn to live with. The first time I walked the perimeter of that mysterious complex, I noticed there were certain corners that just felt off. I do not know if it was the shape of the fences or the buildings beyond them, but it was a presence, like the air got thicker and your skin would tingle. My initial assumption was just that I'm the new guy, probably feeling nerves. But more seasoned guys looked uneasy too. It was an area that demanded attention because everyone around it seemed hyper alert, or sometimes conspicuously uninterested, and you could never figure out why. I was told that my main duties would involve typical security tasks: watch the gates, check badges, ensure lethal force was only used when absolutely necessary. Pretty straightforward. Then they started handing out special detail assignments. And that was how I ended up on a rotation to guard this restricted sector. You got your standard briefing from a commanding officer who read from the usual script about classification levels, the chain of command, and the need to remain tight-lipped. Then they'd pass around a sign and sheet that basically said your cooperation was expected. At first, I chalked it up to classified technology. Maybe they were moving advanced aircraft or experimental materials. After all, we are talking about an Air Force base in the Cold War era. It made sense we'd keep things hush-hush. So I played along. I never really questioned it. Not until I started seeing the cargo trucks. Those trucks would come in around strange hours, mostly at night. They were big, long trailer rigs, often escorted by a small convoy of dark SUVs. Sometimes I'd see a car or two up front and sometimes behind, but always tinted windows. No visible official placards. They'd roll up to our gate, I'd check the man in charge, and the drivers never spoke more than a few words. They'd just nod, hand me some cryptic paperwork that basically read authorized delivery. The forms never contained any detail about the cargo. It was all generic coded references. Then, once the gate was open, they'd vanish into the interior of this restricted zone. And every time they'd pass through, I'd get this sense of foreboding. It was not the presence of any obvious threat. It was more like everyone was working overtime to pretend that none of it was unusual. The next puzzle piece was the noises. We heard them from inside that restricted area. Sometimes you'd get assigned a foot patrol on the perimeter, especially if they thought there might be a security breach, or if they just wanted to keep a heavier presence in that sector. I'd walk along the fence line, shining my flashlight into the darkness, hearing almost mechanical shrieks at times, but not exactly. Clanks and whirs you might expect if someone was operating heavy machinery. But I'd also hear these deeper vibrational hums that sounded too organic for a mere engine. It was eerie, but I'd tell myself it was some generator or ventilation system. After a while, you almost get used to it. Except for that one night in 1983, late fall if I'm remembering right, when the power briefly flickered across the base. Our posts usually had backup generators, but that momentary darkness made those bizarre noises stand out even more. A series of dull bangs from inside that restricted building, like something big was slamming against the interior walls. It was so loud that me and the other airmen on shift exchanged glances, hoping for some rational explanation. I started to suspect that maybe they were storing hazardous materials there, Or maybe it was a supply of undisclosed weaponry. I had heard rumors of strange testing going on at other bases, so I tried to piece it together. But eventually the rumors started swirling among a few of us in the security detail. We whispered about how these convoys were delivering more than just hardware. Some folks swore they glimpsed large metal containers offloaded in the middle of the night. Others talked about occasional glimpses of men in hazmat suits stepping in or out. No official word ever explained it, and we were explicitly told not to ask. We were told to just sign off on the logs, keep vigilant, and mind our own business. Every month or so, you'd get a briefing that ended with a reminder. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, and it is above your pay grade. The hush-hush approach trickled down from higher-ups, who acted oddly whenever certain deliveries arrived. For example, I'd see a high-ranking officer come out, a person I'd normally see around base in a more relaxed manner, suddenly get all grim-faced and serious. They would hover near the gates, quietly ensuring everything was going smoothly with the arrival or departure of those big rigs. Then they'd vanish once the convoy was inside. We rarely saw them exit with the trucks. It was as though they needed to oversee the entrance, but did not want to be associated with the rest of whatever was going on in the building. It was that two-faced approach that made me start doubting the official statements. Like, if this was standard top-secret cargo, you'd expect them to handle it in a more consistent way. Instead, it was always a hush-hush scramble, less about security protocol and more about hiding something. I spent countless nights in that perimeter tower, scanning the area with night vision binoculars. Those were not the best back in the early 80s, but they did the job. The compound was ringed by a fence that had barbed wire at the top, and there were a couple of floodlights, though not nearly as many as you'd think. Often I'd see silhouettes moving back and forth in the yard so quickly that I'd second guess if I'd really seen them at all. They moved with a sense of urgency, but also a certain confidence, like they belonged there. That gave me the impression they had been doing this for a while. Sometimes I'd see them load or unload something from the trucks, but it was always concealed in tarps or stored in large shipping containers. The clang of metal on metal, the hiss of pressurized gas, occasionally a faint beep from instrumentation that sounded out of place for a supply warehouse. At first, I imagined maybe they were fueling up some experimental aircraft, but the shapes were not consistent with any plane parts I'd seen. And anyway, you'd normally do that in a hangar rather than a heavily fenced-in compound with unusual acoustics. One of the biggest jolts came one morning in the midsummer of 1983. I was off duty, wearing my civilian clothes, strolling around the base exchange area, minding my own business. I saw a guy I'd never met wearing a standard Air Force uniform, but with no name tag. He was standing near a black SUV, the same kind I'd see escorting those deliveries. He was scanning the crowds like he was looking for someone. I was behind one of the columns, just sort of people watching, when I noticed this man in uniform quietly approach Colonel M. I'll only use that initial because he's still around. The two of them had a very terse conversation. I could only catch snippets, but I heard references to something about inbound cargo needing a new cover, and that he had just gotten a call from HQ about a possible leak. The colonel told him to keep it close to the vest, to reinforce the protocols. Then they parted ways. I remember thinking, a new cover for inbound cargo. That sounded so clandestine, like even within the chain of command, they were rewriting the official reason for the shipments. It was moments like that which piled up over time, refusing to let me just dismiss it all as standard secrecy. Another time, in spring of 1984, I had a buddy who was also assigned to that restricted area. One night, he rushed into the security station looking pale as a sheet. I asked him what was wrong, but he brushed me off with some story about feeling sick. Later, when we were alone, he told me in hushed tones that he'd heard something behind the building that he could not explain. He said it was like a low rumbling growl, or maybe a mechanical hiss, but it sounded alive somehow. He swore he saw a large shadow where there should have been none, which then disappeared behind some crates. I tried to keep him calm, told him we all get spooked sometimes patrolling at night, but he insisted it was real. He said it was too big to be any ordinary guard dog, and too agile to be a piece of machinery. I believed he believed it. After that, he avoided that area as much as he could. It did not help that a few nights afterward, we had an incident where motion sensors along the fence line tripped repeatedly. Every time we went to check, we found nothing, not a living soul. But the sensor logs showed significant movement, as if multiple figures had been racing back and forth in the darkness. Our commanding officers dismissed it as a technical glitch, but we had never seen that glitch occur anywhere else on base, and it was a modern enough system for the time that random malfunctions seemed unlikely. It was almost like something inside the restricted zone was messing with us, or maybe attempting to get in or out. I began to dread the hours I'd spend in that tower. I'd look for any reason to switch assignments, but we were short-staffed, or so they'd say, so I'd get stuck there again and again. Over those 4 years, from 1982 to 1986, my entire worldview was slowly corroded by the steady drip of secrets and half-truths. We always had these official cover stories about the base's role in cargo transport and refueling operations, but that did not fit. If it was just about shipping something standard, they'd have placed it in the usual secure warehouses. This place was separate, ringed by multiple layers of fencing, and given special guard detail that changed every couple of months. Each time a new wave of MPs arrived, they'd get a fresh briefing about the severe punishments for breaching confidentiality. And that rotating detail meant you never spent enough time there to see everything, except for folks like me who for some reason racked up enough shifts to start connecting the dots. Let me walk you through one particularly odd night in 1984. I remember the weather was terrible, a heavy rain pouring down, turning the entire base into a mess of puddles and drenched concrete. The kind of night you do not want to be outside. I was assigned to gate duty for the restricted area. Sure enough, around midnight, 2 large trucks showed up, each escorted by a black SUV. The lead driver rolled down his window just enough to slip me the paperwork. No greeting, no small talk. I shined my flashlight in the cab, saw the driver wearing an unmarked uniform. Not standard Air Force, but definitely military in its design. He did not flinch, just stared straight ahead. I tried to catch a glimpse of anything else inside, but the angle was bad. I had to step aside as the second truck pulled up behind the first. Both vehicles had some form of identification on the windshield, but it was a series of codes I'd never seen before. The SUV drivers flashed me their identifications, though they did not have standard base passes. It was enough, apparently, because I'd been told explicitly not to turn them away if they had that code. I waved them through. The gate hissed open, and they disappeared inside. About 5 minutes later, I heard a series of crashes and what sounded like shouting from inside the restricted compound. I grabbed my radio to report it, but I was met with immediate instructions from my superior officer to stand down. He said operations inside were not my concern, and that everything was under control. I asked if they needed assistance. He repeated that same line with a sharper edge in his voice, so I had to let it go. That weighed on me. We were trained to respond to audible distress or emergencies, but here I was, forced to ignore screams and loud commotion. That was the moment I realized it was not just about secrecy. Something bigger was happening in there, and they did not want standard security guys messing with it. Roughly half an hour after the crashes, I saw those trucks driving out again. This time, one of the black SUVs was missing. The 2 trucks were followed by only one SUV. The rear doors on the trailers looked dented, like something had slammed against them from the inside. I remember shining my flashlight briefly on one of the trailers as it passed under the gate lights, and I caught a glimpse of deep claw-like scratches on the metal surface. I could not let my mind linger on it, because the driver in the SUV behind them was watching me, as though making sure I would not break protocol. Once they were out, I took note of the time and the details in my log, but I did not dare mention the scratches or the missing vehicle. I was too spooked. I had already seen how others who asked too many questions got shipped off to different assignments or found themselves hammered with disciplinary actions over small missteps. No one said it directly, but you got the message. Keep your mouth shut or face consequences. In fall of that same year, an even stranger event took place. This time, I was inside the compound on foot patrol. walking the perimeter of the main building. We had key cards to access certain external doors, but not all. There was a portion of the building that was strictly off limits to everyone without special clearance. I saw faint light seeping out of a window on the second floor. It was tinted glass, so you could not see much, but I definitely saw giant silhouettes moving around in there, shifting as though they were either extremely large or standing on some platform. Suddenly, the light in that window flickered and went out. The rest of the building remained illuminated by its standard lighting, which only made that dark window stand out more. I had this instinctive urge to radio in, to ask if everything was okay, but I stopped myself. I'd learned that the less you poke around, the safer you remain. Still, my mind was racing with possibilities. Was it some advanced test subject? An experimental piece of tech? But what about those times I'd heard what sounded like an animal or something alive? During these years, I also had some bizarre encounters unrelated to my official duties. For instance, I'd go to the base cafeteria and see some of the higher-ups who supervised that restricted area. They would look extremely tired, like they had not slept in days. Their eyes had this haunted look. Sometimes they'd pick at their food or talk in hushed voices. It was not typical leadership behavior. Then I'd see them in official meetings or ceremonies, and they'd snap back into that crisp, by-the-book demeanor. But behind closed doors, they just seemed troubled. Once I caught a snippet of a conversation between two lieutenants who thought they were alone in the hallway. They whispered something about a schedule change in the facility because of new arrivals. Then one of them said something about how they wished they'd never volunteered, that they could not look at themselves in the mirror anymore. The other told him to keep quiet, that it was beyond their pay grade to question. It was not typical talk for flight scheduling. It seemed more existential, like they'd witnessed something that made them doubt the entire operation. One of the few times I tried to do some direct investigation was in late 1985, when I'd gotten to know one of the civil engineers who occasionally went near that part of the base. He was older, kind of grandfatherly, real friendly. Over a beer at the enlisted club, I asked if he had any idea what that building was for. He paused, gave me a measured look, then said he did not have authorized access. But he mentioned that they'd been asked to reinforce the floors in certain sections a few years back, making them capable of supporting an unusually high load. And they'd installed new drainage systems, but not the normal type you'd see for offices or standard warehousing. This was heavy-duty stuff, almost like you'd need for disposing of or washing away large quantities of something. He trailed off at that point, clearly uncomfortable. He said that was all he was willing to say. He told me as a friend that I should not dig too deep unless I wanted a quick reassignment. I also recall a staff sergeant who transferred to Travis from an overseas posting. He confided in me that he had seen an eerily similar setup at a different installation, though he wouldn't specify where. He muttered something about top-tier hush-hush projects that had no paper trail. He told me to just do my job and keep my head down. Otherwise, I'd risk losing everything I'd worked for. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the sort who did not indulge in rumors. Hearing that from him startled me more than any of the nighttime noises or cryptic trucks. It meant that at least part of what was happening at Travis was part of a broader pattern, not just some random experiment locked away. The entire time, the official stance from base leadership was that the structure in question held classified materials vital to national security. That was the phrase they always repeated, vital to national security. But if I pressed for details, I'd be told that they did not have the authority to share more, or they'd wave me off with a line about me not having the clearance. Some nights I'd lie awake in the barracks, wondering if I'd eventually get the clearance, or if I'd want it. Did I really want to see what was in those shipping containers? I recall one winter night in early 1986, when a rumor spread through the barracks about a near meltdown in the restricted facility. Supposedly, some new piece of equipment overheated, leading to an electrical fire. Yet the base fire department was never officially dispatched. Instead, we saw a fleet of unmarked trucks swarm the compound, while uniformed men I had never seen put out the blaze. By morning, the official stance was that an electrical fuse box had shorted out in a standard warehouse on the premises, and it was all handled. But I overheard bits of chatter suggesting a more severe incident that nearly compromised the entire building. This came from a friend who worked in communications. He said phone lines were blazing hot with calls from off-base to agencies that did not typically contact us. He saw records referencing code words that are not used for normal communications. He got spooked and shut up after that. The next day, the place looked eerily normal again, like they'd cleaned up and reinstalled everything overnight. As I neared the end of my enlistment in 1986, I was torn about whether to re-up. The normalcy of daily life on Travis made it easy to forget about those strange nights. You'd go to the base theater, watch a movie with friends, maybe drive into Fairfield for a weekend, or even make a trip into San Francisco. Life felt ordinary until you found yourself back on shift near that compound. Then that claustrophobic secrecy would creep right back. One thing that especially bugged me was that I never saw or heard of official inspector visits to that facility. We had visits from higher-ranking officers for other parts of the base, but that quiet building seemed to exist in its own dimension, outside the normal command structure. Even our base commander rarely mentioned it publicly. It was like the big white elephant on base that everyone tiptoed around. One evening, a newly arrived lieutenant tried to take charge of the security detail near the compound without the proper clearance. He marched over, demanded the key card, and insisted on leading a patrol inside. Within minutes, we had a flurry of calls from the top brass basically telling him to stand down. The next day, I overheard from a fellow security officer that the lieutenant got a stern talking to behind closed doors. After that, he never went near the place again. If that does not speak volumes about the clandestine nature of the operation, I do not know what does. At times, I'd let my imagination run wild. I'd wonder if maybe we were storing some advanced aircraft parts reverse-engineered from something that was not from around here. The reason I say that is because I'd occasionally see these large containers that did not look like typical cargo crates. They had an almost curved design, with thick reinforced plating. If that was some piece of exotic technology, it might explain why the leadership was so paranoid. But technology alone does not emit those growling or humming noises, nor does it slam against trailer walls with enough force to dent the metal. There's more to it than just advanced gear. Something living. Even thinking about that gave me chills. I also remember hearing a story from a friend of mine who worked in the base medical clinic. He mentioned an odd call one night to scramble a few medics to assist with an injury in the restricted zone, but they were never allowed to see the actual site of the incident. They were held in a separate waiting area until a pair of men in suits hustled one injured soldier in, apparently with a severe laceration on his shoulder. The medics were told to treat the wound without asking any questions. The soldier said he was attacked by a piece of faulty machinery, but my friend said the laceration looked more like a slash or bite of some kind. He did not want to elaborate further. He said the men in suits were watching them the entire time, making sure no one took photos or asked for more details. Once the soldier was stabilized, they whisked him away. There was no official record of the incident in the medical logs. That was the kind of environment we lived in. Everyone had bits and pieces of the puzzle, but no one had the full picture, and each time someone tried to piece it together, they'd be shut down. Meanwhile, I'd see these large trucks come and go. Sometimes they'd leave empty, other times they'd drive out heavier, or so it seemed from how the trailers sagged. I'd see the drivers with eyes that gave away nothing, as if they'd been trained or threatened into stone-faced silence. The more I reflect on it, the more I believe we were dealing with something beyond typical government secrecy. It felt bigger than any standard black project. In my last few months, I had one final weird occurrence. It was around early summer 1986, and I'd already set my discharge date. That evening, I was assigned to a roving patrol, meaning I'd drive around the perimeter in a Humvee, checking each post. I pulled up to the restricted sector, where one of my colleagues was posted, to see how he was doing. He looked anxious, kept glancing at the building. He told me there had been an odd power surge earlier, and for about 2 minutes, every light in that place flickered rapidly. That included the external floodlights and the interior lights we could see through the windows. He also swore he heard a loud, low-pitched roar, something that did not sound mechanical. I asked if he wanted me to stay with him for a bit, and he nodded, obviously spooked. After a while, we heard a rumbling from inside, almost like an earthquake tremor. But the ground was still. It was more like the air was vibrating. Then, silence. Just like that. A few minutes later, the lights stabilized, and everything returned to normal. We reported it, got the usual stand-down response, and that was it. When I finally left the service later that year, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that I would no longer have to guard that place. Dread because of unanswered questions. Over time, I'd read about alleged projects at other bases, or I'd hear conspiratorial talk about hush-hush experiments, and I'd flinch at how close it sounded to what I'd lived through. Part of me wonders if it's still operating exactly the same today, just with more advanced security measures. Another part of me hopes it was decommissioned, or at least handled properly. But the realist in me thinks it's probably ongoing, maybe more well-funded, with bigger budgets and fewer prying eyes. The brand new arrivals to Travis, or any base with a restricted zone, might be rotating onto watch, hearing odd noises at night, seeing trucks roll in, and being told to stay quiet. I think back to specific incidents that still keep me up some nights, such as the unexplainable dents and scratches, the missed or missing SUVs, the scrambling of unmarked medics, the hush-hush after big crashes, or the time I heard the ear-splitting shriek that sounded half electronic and half animal. None of it fits neatly into a single explanation. It was like a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 missing pieces. The official line was that we were maintaining security for national defense projects, so we should be proud to do our part. But the secrecy around it was deeper than anything else on that base, including nuke storage. Yes, even nuclear weapons, if they were present, would have had a more straightforward chain of command. This was different. This felt more unpredictable, more experimental, and more dangerous. I also recall some glimpses of unusual contraptions on the grounds behind the building. It was an area we could only see from the tower when the light was just right. They looked like some sort of rails or tracks, set up in a way that did not correspond to normal vehicle usage. Could they have been testing something that needed to be transported from the building to some loading apparatus? I never saw it used in daylight, though. It might have been done strictly at night. Occasionally, I'd see fresh scorch marks on the concrete in that rear lot, as if large bursts of heat had been applied. The next day, they'd be scrubbing the area clean, but you could still see the faint outlines if you looked close enough. One particularly unnerving conversation I remember was with an intelligence officer who was usually stationed in a different wing. He happened to be passing by the security desk one afternoon when he recognized me from the chow hall. We exchanged pleasantries, and then, in a hushed voice, he told me that I had no idea what was really going on in that compound, and that if I valued my sanity, I'd let it go. He looked genuinely concerned for me, not in a threatening way, but in a sympathetic way, like he knew the mental toll secrets like that could take. Then he walked off. I never talked to him again, but his words echoed in my mind every time I'd think about forging deeper. I realized that some people on base likely had more knowledge than I did, but they were just as trapped by the secrecy. Maybe they had families, careers, or moral qualms that kept them silent. Maybe they'd tried to speak out before and realized it was a losing battle. Or maybe they were all too aware that something bigger than normal classification was involved. It was not just about hiding intelligence from foreign enemies. It seemed more fundamental, like they were guarding knowledge that would unravel conventional understandings of science or reality. The strangest part is how effectively they compartmentalized it. If you only spent a short time on shift near that building, you might see a truck or two, hear a weird noise, shrug, and move on. But for those of us who were stationed there repeatedly, all the odd little details accumulated in the back of our minds, painting a picture that never quite made sense. It was like trying to recall a dream you had a long time ago, except you were wide awake while it was happening. After I left the Air Force, I tried to put it behind me. I told myself that if it was something truly horrendous, it would eventually come to light. But as the years ticked by, I never heard so much as a whisper about it in official channels. I know the base has changed over time, updated its infrastructure, and was restructured in certain areas with new missions. Yet I've never run across any credible leak that confirmed what we suspected. And there were plenty of rumors over the years about black ops or advanced craft, but I never saw a public mention of that restricted building specifically, or the type of cargo we witnessed. It is as if the entire thing was meticulously wiped from the record, or so thoroughly protected that only a handful of high-ranking officials know the truth. Even now, decades later, I occasionally dream about patrolling those fences. In the dream, I'm following some faint sound in the dark, slowly shining a flashlight, and I catch glimpses of shapes just out of reach. The base is silent and deserted, as if I'm the last one alive. Then the shape lunges, or the noise intensifies, and I wake up before I see what it is. I guess that's my subconscious still wrestling with the unknown. People often ask me if I believe in UFOs or cryptids or secret government labs. I've always answered that I do not have solid proof. What I have are memories of things that defy normal explanation. Strange cargo, odd noises, men in unmarked uniforms, strong armed secrecy, and a sense that we were guards not just for a building, but for something that was never meant to see the light of day. A friend of mine, who served with me at Travis, once told me that in the 90s, he spoke to someone who was stationed there after us and asked about that restricted building. The new guy had never even heard of it, which strangely made sense. Either it was shut down or it had been relocated to another part of the base. Another possibility is that it might have been repurposed and sealed off so thoroughly that no one knew it was there. Or maybe it still exists but under a different code name, or under the control of private contractors. I've heard rumors that certain shadowy projects eventually go off-site to private facilities to avoid the standard chain of command. Who really knows? The reason I'm writing this is because I've sat on it for so long, and I came across your YouTube channel which covers these kinds of strange accounts. I do not claim to have all the answers. I can only tell you what I saw and heard during my time as a security officer at Travis Air Force Base in the early 80s. All these years later, I've never seen official disclosure about that place or the projects that were hidden within. I still have vivid memories of the restricted area, the unmarked trucks arriving at odd hours, the cryptic cargo, the bizarre noises that sometimes seemed almost animalistic, and the chilling atmosphere of fear and secrecy among those who were tasked to stand guard. It was not just the military formality that got to me. It was the underlying tension, the sense that we were dealing with something that ordinary protocols did not cover. When I pause and think about it all, part of me wants to dismiss half of what I recall as pure paranoia, but the other part remembers how real it felt, how everything about that detail was unlike the usual routine. You do not imagine giant gashes in trailer walls, or see men walking around in hazmat suits for no reason. Something was going on there, something we were not supposed to understand. Maybe it was evidence of a major national security initiative, or maybe it was more esoteric than that, a secret the government or certain agencies believed the public was not ready to handle. I cannot say for certain, but I think back on those 4 years, and I know that none of it was normal. I never told my family the full story. They just know I served at Travis, performed guard duties, and moved on with my life. I've talked to a couple of old buddies from that time, and they still get that same uneasy feeling when we bring it up, even though we're all older now. There's this unspoken understanding that some secrets never truly die. They just get buried. Whether it was advanced tech, biological experiments, or something else entirely, I doubt we were ever meant to know. My time in the Air Force taught me discipline, but it also showed me that there's a hidden machinery behind the scenes, controlling information so effectively that even those sworn to serve can be left in the dark. I have not tried to contact the base or track down any official records, because I'm sure I'd hit a brick wall, and I'm not looking to cause trouble. I just wanted to share, in my own words, what I experienced. Let it serve as a testament that sometimes reality is far stranger than the rumors or official statements. Those nights in that tower, listening to metal containers clanging, hearing what sounded like living shrieks in the distance, Seeing top brass running around in the shadows taught me that there are corners of our military apparatus that operate well beyond the standard scope of knowledge. Anyway, that is the story as I lived it. 4 years of sporadic glimpses into something I'd never fully understand. All I can do is recount the details, as disjointed or confusing as they might be. If nothing else, I hope it shows that sometimes the official narrative is just a thin cover for something else, and that even those of us who wore the uniform can be left with more questions than answers when it comes to the truly inexplicable.